I sold my car so she could walk across that stage in a cap and gown. My old Toyota, rusted but reliable, gone in a heartbeat for her tuition. I didn't hesitate. I thought, a mother is supposed to sacrifice? When she got her acceptance letter, I cried harder than she did. I worked double shifts at the diner, skipped dentist appointments, ignored my aching knees, and wore the same winter coat for 3 straight years. Every extra dollar went into her books, her rent, her dream. I cut corners so she wouldn't have, too. And I never once complained, because in my mind it was all worth it. All for that day, her graduation day. I arrived early, carrying a bouquet of daisies from the grocery store and a shaky heart that kept whispering, "You did it. You helped her fly." I found my seat in the back row, pressed between 2 strangers. I watched her from a distance, my heart so full it hurt. But then it happened. Her friends gathered around her, laughing, taking selfies. One of them turned toward me and asked, "Is that your mom?" And she, my daughter, smiled, that smile I used to know, and said, "Oh, that's just my mom. She's kind of embarrassing." That word, that tone, it wasn't a joke. She said it like I was something sticky on the bottom of her success. I froze. My hands clenched the flowers so tightly their stems snapped. No one noticed. The applause thundered on. And I sat there nodding like a stranger, realizing something colder than pain I wasn't part of her new life. I had built the bridge, but I wasn't invited to cross it. After the ceremony, I stood near the exit, hoping naively that she'd spot me, hug me, say something that would make it all feel less brutal. She walked past, not alone, surrounded by friends. Her boyfriend, a new crowd that dressed in polished shoes and wore futures like perfume. I waved. She saw me. I know she did. Her eyes met mine for half a second, and then she turned away as if I was someone asking for money on the sidewalk. I didn't follow. I just stood there, clutching the daisies, petals falling one by one onto the concrete. Maybe I should have shouted her name. Maybe I should have reminded her of the nights I stayed up sewing buttons back on her school uniform. Or how I once walked 6 miles in the rain to bring her a forgotten art project. But I said nothing. I just kept standing there like I had nowhere else to be because, in truth, I didn't. The world felt unfamiliar, like I had walked into a play where I no longer belonged on stage. And the hardest part wasn't the insult. It wasn't even the silence, it was the clarity. I had mistaken sacrifice for connection. I had confused giving everything with being needed. And now, in my daughter's happiest moment, I was invisible. No thank you. No photo together. No pride in the woman who broke her own life into pieces so another one could be built. I walked back to the bus stop alone, holding those broken daisies, the wind tugging at my dress, reminding me how cold a June afternoon can feel when the one person you gave everything to doesn't even look back. The bus ride home was silent, except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional cough from an old man across the aisle. I sat by the window, still clutching the flowers like they had something left to give. The paper wrapping was damp from my hands, crushed at the corners. I watched the city roll by, gray buildings, blurred lights, strangers living lives that didn't include me. No one on that bus knew I had just been erased from a story I spent 2 decades writing. I thought about how many times I had dreamed of this day, how many times I told people at the diner, "My daughter's gonna be the first in our family to get a degree." I had said it like it was mine too, like maybe her success would make all the sacrifices worth it. But no one tells you what to do when your dream comes true and you're not part of it. No one prepares you for that kind of rejection. I didn't cry on the bus. I just sat there blinking, as if holding in the tears would somehow hold me together. At home, the apartment felt colder than usual. I placed the daisies in a chipped vase on the kitchen table, even though half the stems were broken and most of the petals had fallen off. I made tea. I stared at the wall, and somewhere between sips and silence, something inside me began to harden, not out of hate, not even anger, just something final, a quiet switch being flipped. A mother grieving a child still alive, and not because she died, but because she had chosen a version of life where I no longer fit. The days that followed felt like walking through a house that used to be mine but no longer recognized me. I kept doing the usual things, making breakfast, watering the plants, folding laundry, but everything felt thinner, like I was living inside a copy of my own life. I stopped texting her, not out of spite, but because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like begging. I thought maybe she'd reach out. Maybe there would be a message, an apology, some awkward attempt to explain that day, but nothing came, just silence. On social media, I saw her graduation photos, her smiling, arms around friends tagged at rooftop bars and brunch places I couldn't afford. No mention of me, not even a thanks mom. It was like I had never existed, and the worst part, no one else seemed to notice. People at work still asked about her. She must be making you proud, they'd say. I smiled and nodded too. Ashamed to tell the truth. Too proud to admit I'd been left behind. The loneliness crept in like a draft under the door, subtle at first, then cold enough to hurt. I began to wonder if maybe I was embarrassing. Maybe I should have tried harder to fit into her new world, learned how to speak like them, dress like them. Maybe if I hadn't worn that old dress or brought daisies instead of roses. The mind does cruel things when it's trying to make sense of being discarded. It rewrites the story and places the blame at your feet, because that's easier than admitting someone you love chose to walk away. And every night I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself the same question. Where did I go wrong? I started making excuses for her in my head. She's just overwhelmed. She didn't mean it. She'd call when things settle down. I told myself these things the way people hum lullabies to fall asleep, soft lies to hush the truth. Every day I checked my phone a little too often. I replayed our last conversations, looking for signs, for cracks I might have missed. I remembered how she used to curl up beside me on the couch, ask me to braid her hair, cry over school bullies and teenage heartbreaks. That little girl was still somewhere in there, I told myself. She had to be. People don't just forget love like that, do they? I held on to those memories like prayer beads, touching each one in silence, hoping it might summon something back. I even baked her favorite cookies one afternoon, without thinking. Chocolate chip, extra soft. I stared at them cooling on the rack and felt ridiculous. No one was coming, but I still packed them in a container, labeled her name on the lid, and placed it in the freezer just in case. Just in case she showed up at the door. Just in case she remembered that I was home. Love does strange things to the mind. It lets you wait for someone who has already left. It lets you pretend the silence is temporary, that erasure is a misunderstanding. I went through old photo albums, tracing her smile with my fingertip. She had my eyes, my stubborn chin. I whispered to those pages as if she could hear me. I'm still here, I said to no one. You'll see. One day you'll see what I gave up so you could stand tall. But deep down, part of me already knew she wasn't looking back. Weeks passed, then a month. The container of cookies remained untouched, the name on the lid starting to fade from condensation. I began to forget the sound of her voice, not entirely, but like a song you once knew by heart that now skips when you try to sing it. I still wore the necklace she gave me on her 16th birthday, tiny silver heart that used to mean everything. Now it felt heavier around my neck, as if even that small symbol was starting to betray me. I stopped checking my phone as much, but the ache didn't ease. It simply settled deeper, like dust in corners you no longer bother to clean. One night, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the street below. A young woman walked past, laughing into her phone, carefree. I wondered if her mother was still in her life, if she knew how lucky she was. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I stopped defending her in my thoughts. The fog began to lift, little by little, and in its place, something colder, sharper emerged. Reality. The kind you don't want to admit, because doing so feels like giving up. But I had to ask myself, what kind of daughter looks at the person who sold their only car for her education and calls her embarrassing? What kind of daughter walks past her mother without a word? The answers came slow, but they came. Not the ones I wanted, but the ones I needed. She had changed. Or maybe she had always been this way and I just hadn't wanted to see it. Either way, the woman I had raised with love had buried me in silent sand for the first time. I began to mourn her as if she were gone. I didn't make a grand decision. There was no dramatic moment where I stood up and declared, enough. It was smaller than that, quieter. One morning, I walked past the mirror in the hallway and didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes were dull. There was a sadness in her face that had settled like permanent lines etched from years of giving and being forgotten. I stood there for a long time just looking, and I asked myself something I hadn't dared to before. When did I stop being someone outside of her? For so long, I had measured my worth through her smile, her success, her approval. But she had taken all those things and shut the door. And I was still standing outside, waiting like a guest. That morning, I made a list, nothing dramatic. Just a scrap of paper on the fridge, go to the park, call Marta, fix the leak under the sink. It sounds ridiculous, but it felt like reclaiming something. I brushed my hair. I put on lipstick, even if no one would see me. I lit a candle at breakfast, just because. Grief doesn't always look like tears. It often looks like neglect. I had been grieving a relationship while pretending to be alive, but now I wanted to start living again, not for revenge. Not even for her to see what she missed, just for me. I couldn't make her remember the nights I slept on the floor when she was sick, or the jobs I turned down to stay close. But I could remember, and I could stop asking for a thank you that would never come. That morning, something began to shift. I was still hurt, but I was no longer waiting. I started doing things I hadn't allowed myself in years. Not because I didn't want to, but because I never felt I had the right. I went to the thrift bookstore downtown and spent 2 hours wandering through the aisles. I picked up a used copy of a novel I used to love in my 20s, one I had read back when I still dreamed of becoming a writer. I sat in the cafe next door and read the first chapter, and I cried not because of the story, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to sit with myself and feel full. I called Marta, my old friend I'd lost touch with during the college years, and we laughed. Like we were 17 again. I even said yes when she invited me to a painting class, even though I was terrified I'd make a fool of myself. And maybe I did. A little, but I also left with paint on my fingers and a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. These weren't big things. They weren't announcements to the world, but they were moments where I became a person again. Not just a mother, not just a woman someone forgot. For the first time in a long time, I didn't define myself by someone else's distance. The pain didn't vanish. It still lived in the corners of my chest, flaring up when I saw girls hugging their mothers in the street or overheard someone say, "I talk to my mom every day." But I stopped letting that pain run the whole show. I let it sit beside me, quietly like an old companion. And instead of trying to make her come back, I started coming back to myself. One evening, I opened the freezer and saw the container with her name still there, frosted over and untouched. For a moment, I stood, with the door open, staring at it like it might speak. Then, slowly, I took it out, peeled off the faded label, and placed it in the trash. Not out of anger, out of mercy. Mercy for myself. Holding on to hope that hurts you is just another form of self-abandonment. I realized I had been clinging to the idea of her, not the reality. The idea that she would wake up one morning, remember everything I'd done, and come running back. But some people don't look back. Some people keep walking, and that doesn't mean they win. It just means they never had the heart to begin with. I used to think motherhood was about unconditional love. Now I believe it's also about knowing when to let go. Letting go doesn't mean I stop loving her. It means I stop bleeding for someone who no longer holds the wound. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and wrote. In my old journal, for the first time in years, I wrote not about her, but about me, my dreams, my regrets, my stubborn hope. It felt like a quiet reclaiming of the woman who existed before motherhood swallowed her whole. I may have lost my place in her story, but I was finding it again in my own. And in that small act of choosing myself, even if no one applauded, even if no one noticed, I felt something rise inside me that hadn't been there in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was okay, but because I finally stopped waiting for someone else to make it okay. 3 months later, I ended up in the hospital. A sharp pain in my chest that I ignored for too long finally demanded attention. The doctor said it wasn't a heart attack, but a warning: high blood pressure, stress, exhaustion. I wasn't surprised. Emotional pain always finds its way into the body eventually. Lying in that hospital bed alone, connected to beeping machines and IV drips, I felt a strange kind of stillness. Not sadness, not fear, just quiet. Like life had paused and was asking me, gently but firmly, what now? That same night, a nurse handed me a clipboard full of forms: next of kin, emergency contact, legal papers in case of anything unexpected. I stared at the blank spaces. I had no one to write. And yet that emptiness gave me the answer I didn't know I was waiting for. If I wasn't part of anyone else's emergency plan, why was everyone still in mine? That's when I made the decision. Quietly, calmly, with no anger in my chest. Just clarity. My house was still in my name, bought with my money, maintained with my hands. I had never changed the deed, never added her. And though I'd once promised it would be hers someday, that day would no longer come. I asked the nurse to bring me a phone and a notary. She blinked, surprised, but did as I asked. Within 48 hours, the house was transferred, still in my name, but now protected under a trust. I added only one person as a beneficiary, myself, because for once I wanted to be the one whose future was considered, not a backup, not a resource, not a forgotten name on a form, just someone who finally decided she mattered too. When I returned home from the hospital, the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, but because I had. I walked through each room slowly, touching the doorknobs, running my hand along the kitchen counter, listening to the creak in the hallway floor. This place wasn't just where I lived. It was the last thing I had built with my own hands and my own choices. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea, and for the first time in years, I didn't imagine her sitting across from me. There was no empty chair waiting, just me and the fullness of my own presence. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept the folder of old documents, bills, her college applications, letters from her childhood. I sifted through them one last time, then chose what to keep. A drawing she made when she was 6. A letter she wrote for Mother's Day in 4th grade. The rest I let go. I didn't burn them. I didn't shred them in anger. I just placed them in a box and tucked it into the attic. Some memories no longer need to be fed. The next day, I called a lawyer to finalize the trust, made a copy of the documents and placed them in a locked drawer under my bed. No one else needed to know. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was the quiet reclaiming of my own life. I had been a mother for so long that I forgot I was also a woman, a person, someone whose story didn't have to end in someone else's silence. The house was no longer a promise. It was a boundary, a soft but firm reminder that love given freely does not mean love owed forever. A week later, I received a message from her, short, almost robotic. "Hey, heard you were in the hospital. Hope you're okay." No call, no visit, just a handful of words typed without punctuation, like an afterthought. Tossed into the wind, I stared at it for a long time, unsure of what to feel. A part of me still wanted to be moved by it, still wanted to read into it some flicker of remorse, but I had grown past crumbs. I no longer felt hunger for what barely resembled care. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I no longer needed her response to feel whole. That was the shift. Healing doesn't always come with apologies or closure. Sometimes it comes when you stop hoping for either. That afternoon, I went out and bought new curtains. Something small, light yellow. They caught the sun in a way that made the whole room feel warmer. I cooked dinner and played music, not for anyone else, but for the woman who had spent too long eating in silence. I laughed at a show on TV, and when the phone buzzed again her name, lighting up the screen, I turned it over. I didn't need to read it. I already knew what it would say. Surface words, convenient timing, another checkmark of duty rather than love. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. It simply didn't matter, because I had chosen myself. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in reverence. She would live her life as she chose, and I would live mine, not waiting, not aching, not sitting in a shadow she had no intention of stepping out of. I had already given her the best of me. What remained was finally mine to keep. It was a Sunday morning when she showed up. No warning, no call ahead, just a knock at the door I hadn't expected to hear again. I opened it slowly, and there she was, standing in jeans and sunglasses, holding a to-go coffee like she was stopping by a stranger's house out of politeness. Her smile was tentative, almost forced, like she didn't quite know how to begin. "Can I come in?" she asked, like it had only been weeks instead of nearly a year of silence. I stepped aside without a word, not out of habit or guilt, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what this visit really was. She walked through the hallway slowly, glancing at the new curtains, the rearranged furniture, the framed photo of me, and Marta laughing at the beach. It wasn't the same house anymore, and I think she knew it. We sat in the kitchen, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the clock ticking. She said she'd been busy, that life had gotten complicated. She didn't look me in the eye. Her words floated in the air like they were rehearsed. I listened, not because I expected truth, but because I wanted to hear what version of the story she had decided to tell herself. She didn't mention the graduation, or the silence, or the messages left unanswered. And when she finally said, "I thought maybe we could talk about the future," I simply nodded and stood up. I walked to the drawer beneath my bed, pulled out the envelope with the house documents, and handed it to her. No words, just the facts. Her face went pale as she read, and in that moment, I saw it the first time she realized I no longer belonged to her story either. She looked up from the papers like they were written in a language she didn't understand. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time, not in sadness, but in disbelief. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do what years of words had failed to speak. "It's the deed," I finally said. "The house is in a trust now, protected." Her eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with something else, entitlement. "Maybe," I thought. "You said this would be mine one day." I smiled gently, not to mock her, but because I had rehearsed this moment in my mind and never thought it would feel so quiet. "That was before," I said. "Before I realized I had built a home for someone who saw me as a burden." She opened her mouth to argue, to twist the timeline, to pretend it hadn't happened the way it did, but I didn't give her space to rewrite history. "I sold my car," I said calmly, "worked extra shifts, missed sleep, spent years giving you everything, and you called me embarrassing." The weight of the word landed between us like a stone. She blinked fast, as if tears might fix what had already unraveled. "I didn't mean," she began, but I raised my hand, not in anger. Just enough to say, "You've said enough." I told her the guest room was made up if she needed to rest, but the decisions had already been made, not out of spite, out of love finally turned inward. She stayed the night, quiet, small, And in the morning when she left without taking the papers, I didn't watch her go. I simply made breakfast, poured myself coffee, and sat in my chair finally at peace in a home I no longer owed to anyone. That morning, the sun poured through the yellow curtains just right. It touched the table, the floor, the corner where I kept my books as if reminding me that light returns even after the longest winters. I sat in that golden silence, sipping coffee from my favorite mug, and felt something I hadn't known in years. I was no longer waiting, not for a phone call, not for an apology, not for a version of love that came with conditions and quiet punishments. She hadn't stayed for breakfast, she hadn't said sorry, and yet I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt clean, like a page turned without a rip. I had given her life. I had given her everything I had, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to keep anything for myself until now. Now I had this house, my name on the deed, my own routines, my own quiet joys, a painting class on Thursdays, walks in the park with Marta, books stacked by the bed, and a heart that still loved us, not at the expense of its own pulse. People think strength is loud, sharp, filled with grand speeches and slammed doors, but real strength is softer. It's the woman who stays kind after being forgotten, the mother who sets a boundary without bitterness, the human who reclaims her name without needing to be heard. If she ever comes back, truly comes back not for the house, not for the comfort, but for me, I will open the door, but not the way I once did. Not from desperation, not from the hope of being chosen again. I'll open it as a woman who knows her worth, and until that day, if it ever comes, I'll keep living in peace, surrounded by the life I finally chose to make my own.